This Easter morning, I'm going to speak of the meaning of the cross in terms even larger than the traditional Christian meaning that it has held for the past 2,000 years. I will also be speaking of what I believe. And the transformation I will be talking about is not only descriptive of human spiritual development, but also what has been and continues to be my personal journey. I spent the first 9 years of my life in the country of my birth, Venezuela. In the late 40s and early 50s, Catholicism permeated all of my surrounding culture. There, among the delicious food, music, way of speaking, soft breezes and lovely weather, family, friends, gossip and politics was the church. It was in the very air we breathed. When Easter week would come around, the air was heavy with gloom and grief. My grandmother, a devout Catholic, would listen on the radio to the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday and would go into excruciating detail, as only grandmothers can do. When Easter Sunday finally came around after a long and dreary Saturday, it was a huge relief. But for me, although I was very glad and amazed that Jesus had risen from the dead, it didn't fully make up for the horror of the previous Friday. La Iglesia, the church, was the huge home and family to which we all belonged and where we could always find welcome, shelter in times of trouble, forgiveness for our sins, and love. The cathedral we attended was a large, fragrant space lit by soft sunlight filtered through glowing stained glass windows. I loved how it felt, except for the large realistic crucifix over the beautiful and ornate altar. I encountered paradox, the comforting, loving, all-encompassing church, also containing within it the life-size image of the crucified Jesus. My inner conflict with the church and the God I loved began very early. I came of age in the 60s, the age of Aquarius. The hippie culture, the direct descendants of the Beat generation who rebelled against post-World War II conformity, the gray flannel suit, the cookie-cutter home in the newly sprouting suburbs, and who delved deeply into Eastern mysticism, literature, jazz, and drugs. Among my cultural milestones were Flower Power, Motown, the Beatles, Timothy Leary, Vietnam, civil rights, the Great Society, the demonstrations, the sit-ins, and the political assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King. In that burgeoning turmoil of ditching conformity, intoxicating possibility, and tragedy, there was also immense cynicism. My hippie friends were all very hopeful and burning with the fire of righteousness. My preppy friends were cynical and holding on to their copies of Sartre and Camus. I had no words for what I felt, for what I have always felt, that God is real and she has my back. It's in my bones, it's in my cells, but I couldn't go to any Christian church because I felt to do so, I had to check my brains in at the door. Yet I had this undying certainty that there is an enlivening principle that gives rise to all we see or can detect with our instruments when we can't see. I wanted to give a home to my spirituality, so like so many others at that time, I turned to the East, to Hinduism. There I found coherence in its unity principle of Brahman, the universal force that permeates all things. Then I discovered the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and his analytical psychology. I felt deeply validated when I read that Jung recognized that spirituality is a fundamental aspect of the human psyche. He found it in all of the patients that he encountered at the Burgosli Medical Hospital, where he worked for 9 years, and where he formulated the idea of the collective unconscious after coming across common ideas and symbols in completely unrelated individuals and cultures. In his 1933 book of essays, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung expresses his ideas about the importance of the religious function in the human psyche and the extent of the alienation experienced by modern humans brought about by the ascendancy of science over religion and the consequent unmooring of the spiritual aspect of the psyche from having relevance in human life. Jung looked at spirituality and its expression in religion as important not only as an anchoring belief system, but more importantly, at its symbolic significance in the development of the psyche in the process of individuation or self-realization. Jung has a very positive view of the psyche. It is a living entity which is always heading toward wholeness or its complete realization as much as possible in a person's lifetime. All its manifestations, even in dysfunction, are aimed at correcting erroneous adaptations and attitudes. I had found my guy. I didn't have to leave my spirituality behind anymore. I was in London, England at the time. I was in profound culture shock. I missed New York City and my friends profoundly. But discovering Jung gave me a whole new world to explore, my own interiority. And the libraries and bookshops in London had all his books. There was even a Jungian society there, so I could attend lectures. Among the myriad significant things I found in Jung's psychology was his idea that the Christian cross symbolizes the suspension of humanity between the poles of duality inherent in all earthly existence. Consequently, the destiny of humanity is to hold the tension of the opposites during life. Jung holds that in Western thought, including Christianity, there is a cleaving to the light and a rejection of the dark or shadow aspects of ourselves. He says wholeness includes integrating the shadow. To remain unconscious of the shadow means not only that we are internally divided in continual conflict with ourselves, but also that we are condemned to project it onto the other, leading to catastrophic consequences both personally and on the national and world stage. We continue to see this profound insight play out not only in our world, but also right now in our own country. I can tell you from personal experience that shadow work is the work of a lifetime. No one wants to look at what is less than admirable in themselves, and I was no exception. However, I also had a very difficult time really understanding how to integrate my shadow. I have learned in the intervening decades that one acknowledges it, allowing its presence into one's awareness, not an easy feat, and even accepting it, but not acting on its urges. Just allowing it into consciousness begins to change it, and it has great value. The current emphasis on understanding the ego and disidentifying from it is very helpful. The ego is a necessary part of our psyche. It is a navigator, but it is not all there is to us. There is also the self with a capital S, that is our essential being. It is the awareness in which our life and our reactions to it occur that is who we really are. The self is what we access when we rest in our own awareness during meditation. The ego is a complex of ideas, emotions, reactions, defenses, and learning that pilots us through life. But it is not who we are. It is a construction that begins to be put together in the womb, and if we are lucky, we don't have to do too much deconstructing of it as we mature. It is what gets examined during all types of therapy and analysis, and through self-examination as we go through life and have realizations about ourselves. Acknowledging the shadow, our own inconsistencies, is the internal part of holding the tension of the opposites within ourselves. The external part is holding the paradoxes of our personal or communal circumstances, the inconsistencies of human existence. I would revisit Christianity from time to time. My time with Hinduism and Jung expanded my horizons so I could look objectively at what was positive about it. I explored the writings of John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, participants in the Jesus Seminar, a group of Bible scholars who did a deep dive into the New Testament to see if they could discern what Jesus really said. I found a deep resonance with the teachings of Jesus and realized repeatedly that his teachings and what Christianity has become are almost polar opposites. Fast forward 40 years plus, and I was introduced to the teaching of Catholic Franciscan priest and spiritual teacher, Father Richard Rohr. Father Richard describes himself as being on the inside of the outside edge of Catholicism. There are many who are outraged by his teachings. Excuse me. Not me. He is a teacher who speaks from the ground of the perennial philosophy, that common ground that mystics of all religions occupy. And that is the ground of oneness of all that is, the interdependent web of all existence. He points out that in the West, with the rise of rationalism during the Enlightenment, Western thought became wedded to dualism, the province of the left brain. This includes discernment, the ability to distinguish between one thing and another, which has been extremely successful and has led to our enormous technological development and advancement. But in true paradoxical fashion, it has come at a huge price, part of which is the endangered viability of our biosphere. Excuse me. In religion, as in all thought, polarity makes for choosing one side or the other. It bolsters the ego's need to be right at all costs, and it leads to extremism and the tremendous cruelties and destruction that result. We have many examples in past and current history and in our own daily lives. While dualism is necessary and beneficial in life, something beyond it is needed: unity, consciousness. The only way to resolve the tension of dualism's either-or perspective is the both-and of unity, the third thing that contains them both and from where they originate. Father Richard says in one of his many deeply insightful books, The Naked Now, Learning to See as the Mystics See, all the religions at the more mature levels learn and teach a different consciousness, which we call the contemplative mind or the non-dual mind. The levels of spiritual development begin with dualistic, exclusionary, either-or thinking and become increasingly non-dual, allowing for a deeper, broader, wiser, more inclusive and loving way of seeing. If we are to live on this earth, we cannot bypass the necessary tension of holding contraries and inconsistencies together. Daily, ordinary experiences teach us non-duality in a way that is not theoretical or abstract. It becomes obvious in everything and everybody, every idea and every event, almost hidden in plain sight. Everything created is mortal and limited, and if we look long enough, paradoxical. By paradox, I mean something that initially looks contradictory or impossible, but in a different frame or at a different level is in fact deeply true. I am talking about just holding the tension, not necessarily finding a resolution or closure to paradox. We must agree to live without resolution, at least for a while. This is very difficult for most people, largely because we have not been taught how to do this mentally or emotionally. We didn't know we could, or even should. I think opening to this holding pattern is the very name and description of faith. Unfortunately, in Christianity, faith largely became believing in things to be true or false, intellectual assent, instead of giving people concrete practices so they could themselves know how to open up, faith, hold on, hope, and allow an infilling from another source, love. We must move from a belief-based spirituality to a practice-based spirituality, or little will change. We will merely continue to argue about what we are supposed to believe and who the unbelievers are. We need contemplative practices to loosen our egoic attachment to certainty and retrain our minds to understand the wisdom of paradox. Contemplative prayer or meditation is largely just being present, holding the tension instead of even talking it through or fixing it by words or ideas, loving reality as it is instead of understanding it fully. In our daily lives, this holding is most commonly articulated as a willingness to say, I don't know. That may sound impractical, but the way of faith is not the way of efficiency. So much of life is just a matter of listening and waiting and enjoying the expansiveness that comes from such willingness to hold. He continues, how do we live the contradictions? Live them, not just endure them or relieve ourselves from the tension by quickly resolving them. The times when we meet or reckon with our contradictions are often turning points, opportunities to enter into deeper mystery. I'm deliberately using the word mystery to point to depth, an open future, immense freedom, a kind of beauty and truth that cannot be fully spoken or defined. Many mystics speak of the God experience as simultaneously falling into the abyss and being grounded. This sounds like another contradiction. But when we allow ourselves to fall into the abyss, into hiddenness, limitlessness, unknowability, a void without boundaries, we discover it's somehow a rich, supportive, embracing spaciousness where we don't have to ask or answer the questions of whether we're right or wrong. We're being held and so do not need to try to hold ourselves together. This might be the ultimate paradox of the spiritual experience, falling into the hands of the living God, Hebrews 10:31. When we can give ourselves to it and not fight it or explain it, falling into the abyss is ironically an experience of ground, of the rock, of the foundation. This is totally counterintuitive. Our dualistic, logical mind can't get us there. It can only be known experientially. Mystery is not something we can't know. Mystery is endless knowability on many different levels. Living inside such endless knowability is finally a comfort, a foundation of ultimate support, security, unrestricted love, and eternal care. It usually takes much of our life to get there. It's surely what we mean by growing in faith. Each soul must learn on its own, hopefully aided by other fellow travelers on the path who are ahead of them. Summing up, the source of spiritual wisdom is to hold questions and contradictions patiently, much more than to find quick certitudes, to rush to closure or judgment as the ego or the dualistic mind want to do. The ego wants to know it is right. It wants to stand on its own self-created, solid ground, not the mysterious ground of the abyss. This is why so much religion remains immature and is often a hiding place for people who want it to be in control instead of people trained in giving up control to a loving presence. For me, going beyond either-or thinking through meditation, reading, and listening to spiritual teachers, and sustaining the alchemy that experiencing my life has been, and sustaining the alchemy that experiencing my life brings has been the road to learning how to deal and tolerate with my own personal challenges and our own current extremely difficult collective social spiritual environment. This particular phase of my spiritual transformation began when Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. Another paradox, a silver lining in the cloud. 8 years and much experiential learning later, I feel stronger, larger, more able to deal with whatever lies ahead. I'm also humbler and much better at accepting what is rather than how I think life should be. A very hopeful place to be this Easter morning. Thank you for listening. Namaste and blessed be. Thank you. Thank you.